That was the moment I knew every sleepless night had been worth it. The moment my daughter's future mother in law reached for her wine glass, brought it to her lips with that practiced elegance she wore like armor, and then stopped. Because every eye in that banquet hall had turned to me. Standing at the microphone, she had just handed over, holding a folder that was about to dismantle everything she had spent 40 years building. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 61 years old. For 32 years, I worked as a certified public accountant at a mid-sized firm in Columbus, Ohio. I balanced books, I found errors, I followed money trails through mazes that other people designed specifically to confuse. It was quiet work, invisible work, the kind of work that nobody thinks about until something goes very wrong. I retired early. My knees were fine. My mind was sharp. I simply decided that I had earned the right to read books on my porch and tend my garden and have dinner ready when my son came to visit on Sundays. I never expected to use my skills the way I used them that October evening. But I am getting ahead of myself. My son Daniel is 34 years old. He has his father's jawline and my stubbornness, which is both a blessing and a curse. He works as a structural engineer for a firm that contracts with the city, the kind of job where you spend your days making sure buildings do not fall down on people. He is careful, precise, and genuinely good. I do not say that because I am his mother. I say it because I have watched him be good his entire life, even when it would have been easier not to be. He met Sophia Caldwell 2 years ago at a charity auction. She was volunteering at the registration table. He was there because a colleague had dragged him along. He told me later that he spilled coffee on the sign-in sheet and she laughed instead of being annoyed. And that was that. I met Sophia 3 weeks after they started dating. Daniel brought her to Sunday dinner. She was warm and funny, a little nervous in the way people are when they want to make a good impression on someone who matters. She helped clear the table without being asked. She asked about my garden and actually listened to the answer. I liked her immediately. What I liked less when I eventually encountered them were her parents. The Caldwells owned a restaurant group called Caldwell Hospitality. 6 upscale restaurants across central Ohio, the kind of places where the menu has no prices and the waitstaff introduce themselves by first name and explain each dish like a museum exhibit. Franklin Caldwell had built the business from one steakhouse his father left him and turned it into something that regularly appeared in regional lifestyle magazines. His wife, Diane, was the face of it. Charity events, fundraisers, junior league. The sort of woman who wore a silk blouse to a casual lunch and made you feel underdressed in your own home. I understood the dynamic before I ever sat across a table from them. Daniel and Sophia got engaged in April. He called me first before he even told his friends, and I cried in a way that embarrassed us both, and then we laughed about it. Sophia called me 20 minutes later and called me mom for the first time, and I had to sit down on my kitchen floor. The engagement party was the Caldwell's idea. They insisted on hosting. Their home in Dublin, Ohio, was the kind of place that had a name, a 6-bedroom colonial on 2 acres with a pool house and a catering kitchen separate from the regular kitchen. There were 60 guests, most of them the Caldwell's friends and business associates. People whose names I recognize from the society pages my late husband used to make fun of every Sunday morning. I wore a deep green dress that I had bought for my nephew's graduation. I did my hair. I drove myself because I wanted the option to leave when I needed to. Diane Caldwell met me at the door with a smile that had been practiced in mirrors. Margaret, we've been so looking forward to meeting you. Daniel tells us you were an accountant. I was, I said. How wonderful. Her tone suggested it was not particularly. Franklin worked with an accountant for years, very detail-oriented people. She said detail-oriented the way someone else might say nearsighted. Come in, come in. The bar's in the sitting room. Our event coordinator can help you find your seat. She was already looking past me at the next arriving guest. I found my seat. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a server in a white jacket. I watched my son across the room, his hand on Sophia's back, the two of them laughing with a cluster of young people I did not know. He looked happy. The kind of happy that is so complete, it makes you ache a little just to see it. The toast came after dinner. Franklin Caldwell spoke first. He talked about Sophia, about how she had grown into a woman who made him proud every day. He talked about legacy and the family name and the restaurants and what it meant to build something that outlasted you. He shook Daniel's hand with both of his and called him a fine young man and said he was glad to welcome him into the family. I started to relax. Then Diane took the microphone. She had the particular skill of making everything sound like a compliment while it wasn't. I recognized it immediately. I had worked with people like her for decades. I want to say a few words about Daniel, she began, tilting her head in my direction with a gracious smile. When Sophia first told us she was seeing someone, we asked all the things parents ask. And she told us, he's an engineer, Mom. He works for the city. His mother is retired. She paused. There was light laughter. We come from a world of hospitality, of presentation, I think the word is refinement. And I'll be honest, we wondered. But Daniel has been nothing but respectful and hardworking. And I think what he lacks in background, he more than makes up for in character. She raised her glass. To Daniel, may he grow into everything the Caldwell name will ask of him. The room applauded. I sat very still. Daniel was smiling, a polite, stiff smile that I had seen on his face exactly twice before in his life. Once at his father's funeral, when the distant relatives kept telling him to be strong, and once when a coach cut him from his high school baseball team for a reason that was never properly explained. He knew what had just happened. He was choosing not to react because Sophia was watching him with hopeful eyes. And I understood with absolute clarity that I was the only person in that room who was going to do anything about any of this. I did not say anything that night. I drove home in the dark on the highway, and I thought very carefully. Because I had learned something in 32 years of accounting that most people never learn. You do not react to the surface. You look underneath. You follow the numbers. You find out what is actually there before you decide what to do about it. People who need to make others feel small are usually doing it to protect something. I decided to find out what the Caldwells were protecting. I started with public records. This is where most people give up because public records are dense and unglamorous and require patience that most people do not have. I have that patience. I built my career on it. I pulled the business registrations for Caldwell Hospitality, LLC. I found their state filings, their registered agent, their structure. Found 3 subsidiary LLCs that were not mentioned anywhere on their website or in any of the magazine profiles. I found a 4th that had been dissolved 18 months ago with no public explanation. I spent 2 weeks at my dining room table, which I slowly covered in printed documents and yellow legal pads. What I found in the 3rd week changed everything. Caldwell Hospitality had settled a wage claim 2 years prior, quietly. A group of kitchen workers, mostly from their downtown location, had filed a complaint with the Ohio Department of Commerce alleging they had been paid below minimum wage for tipped employees and denied overtime for years. The settlement was sealed, meaning the amount was not public, but the filing itself was. It was a matter of record, buried so thoroughly that you would have to know exactly where to look to find it. I knew exactly where to look. I found 2 more complaints filed in different years, both from back of house staff, both settled before they became formal proceedings. A pattern: quiet, expensive, and very deliberately kept quiet. I started looking at their property filings. The restaurants operated out of buildings, some owned, some leased. One of the owned properties in Westerville had an interesting history. It had been purchased through one of those subsidiary LLCs at a price that was difficult to explain given the market at the time. The seller of that property was a holding company registered in Delaware. The registered agent for that Delaware company was a man named Gerald Sutter. Gerald Sutter also appeared in Caldwell Hospitality's vendor records, which I found through a combination of court documents and a Business Journal article from 4 years ago that named him as a supplier. A business owner selling property to his own client through a shell company in another state. This was not illegal on its face, but it was the kind of arrangement that, in my experience, did not happen accidentally. I needed help with this part. I called a former colleague named Patricia Wu, who had left our firm to work for the state auditor's office and then eventually moved into labor law. We had lunch at a diner near her office, and I laid out everything I had found. Patricia listened without interrupting, which told me she was taking it seriously. "Margaret," she said when I was finished, "do you know how many people would have noticed any of this?" "Some," I said. "Very few." She folded her hands on the table. "What do you want to do with it?" Told her I was not sure yet. I told her my son was marrying into this family in 5 months, and I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I decided anything. She told me that the wage complaints alone were a matter she could look into through proper channels. She said the property arrangement was worth a separate conversation with someone she knew at the state attorney's office. She said she would make some calls. I told her I would be in touch. For 3 weeks after that, I sat with everything because Daniel was happy, because Sophia was genuinely good and whatever her parents were, she was not that. Because sometimes the right thing and the merciful thing point in very different directions, and you have to choose which one you can live with. And then I went to dinner with Daniel and Sophia at one of the Caldwell restaurants, the flagship location downtown, and I watched. I watched the way the back of house staff moved through the kitchen, visible through the pass-through window. I watched a food runner get quietly reprimanded by a manager for something so small I could not even identify what it was. I watched the servers' faces when they thought no one was looking. I had spent decades reading financial documents, but I had also spent decades in offices with people who were under pressure they were not allowed to talk about. I knew what it looked like. After dinner, I excused myself to use the restroom, and I went instead to the hallway near the kitchen entrance. A young woman was sitting on a stool near the service door, her uniform jacket off, eating something quickly from a small container. She looked up when she heard me. I apologized for startling her. I told her the food had been wonderful. She thanked me reflexively, and then, because I was an older woman who was clearly not a manager and who was looking at her with something that might have been concern, she said, "It's been a long week." I said, "Is it always like this?" She looked at me for a moment, deciding something. "We're short again," she said. "Third week in a row. Management keeps cutting shifts, but the tables don't get cut." Thanked her. I went back to my table. I smiled across at my son and his beautiful fiancée, and I made my decision. That night, I called Patricia. "Whatever you are going to look into," I said, "you can start." I want to be clear about something. I did not go to the wedding planning to make a scene. That is not who I am, and it was not the plan. The plan was that Patricia's contacts would do what needed to be done through the appropriate channels, that the Caldwells would face consequences through systems designed for exactly that purpose, and that Daniel and Sophia would know the truth privately in time to make informed decisions. What changed my plan was the rehearsal dinner. Diane Caldwell had arranged the rehearsal dinner at their home. 40 people, catered. The kind of event that was designed to look casual while being anything but. I arrived with Daniel, who picked me up because Sophia had gone ahead earlier to help with setup. I was walking through the side hallway toward the back patio when I heard voices coming from Franklin Caldwell's office. The door was not fully closed. I was not trying to listen. I stopped because I heard my son's name. The question is how long we can keep the Westerville situation quiet. Franklin's voice. "The filing is sealed, Frank. We've been over this." A third voice. A man I did not recognize. "The new one won't be sealed. If Gutierrez actually goes through with it, we are looking at a very different situation." Silence. "The timing is unfortunate," Diane said. Her voice was perfectly level. "With the wedding and everything, the last thing we need is press. Bradley thinks if we counter with a subsidiary structure, we can argue the liability doesn't attach to the parent company. And if that doesn't hold, then we have a problem. But that's not our problem tonight." A pause. "What concerns me more is Margaret." I stopped breathing. "She was an accountant," Diane Estrada said, 30 years. "Franklin, I need you to understand what that means. She knows how to read things. If she gets curious, she's retired, Franklin said. She gardens. She's not going to. I don't want to take that chance. After the wedding, we need to make sure Daniel understands what information stays in the family. I stood in that hallway for 10 seconds. Then I walked quietly back the way I had come, found the patio, found a chair near the edge of the garden, and sat in the evening air until my hands stopped trembling. They were not just hiding things. They were planning to manage my son. They were planning to use this marriage to make sure he understood in whatever polite and practiced way the Caldwells managed everything that certain things were not to be asked about or shared. They were not gaining a son-in-law. They were acquiring someone to keep quiet. I texted Patricia that night. Move as quickly as you can. I'll handle the rest. The wedding was a Saturday in October, held at a vineyard venue an hour outside the city. 280 guests, a tent strung with warm lights, an orchestra for the cocktail hour. The Caldwells had been planning it for 8 months. And they had done what they always did, made it look exactly the way things were supposed to look. I wore black, Daniel noticed when he picked me up. Mom, the dress we looked at was blue. I know. I kissed his cheek. You look wonderful. Why are you wearing black to my wedding? Because I'm prepared for the weather, I said. He gave me the look that meant he knew I was not being fully honest, but there was too much happening that morning for him to press it. I carried my bag with me to my seat in the front row. It was heavier than usual. The ceremony was held outside, on the lawn, rows of white chairs facing an arch wound with autumn flowers. Sophia walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and she was extraordinary. She was the thing in all of this that was real and true, and I held that in my mind very deliberately. Whatever was about to happen, Sophia deserved to know the truth, and so did Daniel. They exchanged vows that they had written themselves. Daniel's voice cracked once on the word always, and I pressed my lips together and looked at the sky for a moment. Then they were married, and everyone stood, and I stood with them. The reception moved inside the tent. The Caldwells had arranged the schedule: cocktails, dinner, then toasts. I ate very little. I watched the room. Patricia had texted me that afternoon with 3 words: "It's moving forward." I had texted back, "So am I." Franklin spoke first, as he had at the engagement party. He was polished and gracious. He talked about how proud he was of Sophia, about what it meant to see your child find their person. He said Daniel was a man of integrity. He meant it as a compliment. I found it interesting that he said it. Then Diane stood. She had clearly prepared this. She held the microphone with the ease of someone who had given many speeches in many rooms and had never once felt unsure of her reception. When Sophia told me she had met someone, I asked her what his family was like. She said, "Mom, his mother is the most capable woman I've ever met. She's quiet about it, but she sees everything." Diane smiled at me across the tent. It was a careful smile. "I think that's true. I've seen that in you, Margaret." She turned back to the room. "What I want to say is that we are welcoming Daniel into our family today, and with him, his history, his background, his mother's, let's call it a different world than ours. And we believe that's a strength. Different perspectives, different origins. It keeps a family from becoming too insular." She lifted her glass. To Daniel and Sophia, may the Caldwell name be worthy of the best of both of them. There was warm applause. Sophia was smiling. Daniel was not quite smiling. It was the word origins that did it, said in that particular tone. Different origins, like he was a product with an interesting provenance. Something acquired that added variety. I stood up. I did not plan the exact moment. It arrived, and I stood up because it was time. Diane saw me. She extended the microphone with a pleasant expression. Margaret, did you want to add something? Yes, I said. Thank you. I walked to the front of the tent. 280 people looked at me. I was aware of Daniel's face going still and the way it went still when he was trying to understand something. I was aware of Sophia reaching for his hand. I set my bag on the edge of the head table and I opened it. I've been a CPA for 32 years, I said. When you spend that long following numbers, you start to notice when they don't add up. And when numbers don't add up, it usually means someone has worked very hard to make sure they don't. The room was quiet in a particular way. The orchestra had stopped between sets. No one filled the silence. I held up the first document. In 2021, a group of kitchen workers filed a wage complaint against Caldwell Hospitality, LLC. They alleged systematic underpayment of tip minimum wage and denial of overtime across at least 2 restaurant locations. The complaint was settled quietly. The amount is sealed, but the filing is public record. I set the page on the table. A second complaint was filed in 2019, a third in 2017. All settled, all sealed, all involving workers who, based on the public portions of those filings, were primarily recent immigrants who may not have fully understood their rights under Ohio labor law. I heard a sound from the Caldwell side of the room. Franklin had stood up. This is completely inappropriate. Less inappropriate, I said, looking at him directly, than asking those workers to do it again next week with no recourse. I turned back to the room. I held up the second document. Caldwell Hospitality purchased a commercial property in Westerville 3 years ago through a subsidiary LLC. The seller was a holding company registered in Delaware. The registered agent for that Delaware company is a man who appears in Caldwell Hospitality's vendor records as a supplier. I'm not a lawyer, but I did call one. And she called someone at the state attorney's office, who found it very interesting. Complete silence. Diane had sat down. Her face had not changed expression, which told me everything about how much practice she had at this. I picked up the last document. 3 days ago, a former Caldwell employee named Rosa Gutierrez filed a new complaint. This one will not be sealed. She has an attorney, she has documentation, and she has the contact information for every person who filed before her. I set the paper down. I'm giving a copy of everything in this folder to the journalist who is sitting at table 11. She covers labor and business for the Columbus Dispatch. She reached out to me when she heard through a source that there was a story developing. I told her she was welcome to attend as a guest. I looked at my son. Daniel was watching me with an expression I had seen only once before. The night his father died, when he understood something true and large and irreversible had entered his life. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it in a complicated way that he would understand later. I kept this until now because I needed it to be undeniable. And because I needed you both to understand what kind of people are asking you to keep their secrets. I handed the folder to the woman at table 11. Then I stepped back from the microphone and I went to sit beside my son. What happened next was not like a movie. There was no single dramatic collapse. It was more like watching a tide go out very fast, the way it does before a wave. Franklin tried to intercept the journalist and was stopped by his own attorney, who had clearly been waiting for something and now understood that the waiting was over. Diane sat at the head table for 45 minutes without moving. And I do not know what she was thinking, but I think she was doing something she had probably not done in a long time, which was calculate what she could not control. Sophia cried. She came to me first before she even spoke to her parents. And I held her because she had not done this, and she needed to know that. Did you know? She asked me. Did you know before? I started finding out in August, I said. I'm sorry it took this long. My parents. She stopped, started again. The workers, those people. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Rosa Gutierrez. I know that name. She was at the downtown location for years. She looked at me. She left suddenly. They told us she had a family issue. She had a lawyer, I said. Sophia nodded slowly. Then she straightened up, the way people do when they are heartbroken but not broken, and she went to find Daniel. I watched my son talk to his new wife in the corner of that tent. The music long stopped, guests drifting out in uncertain groups, and I felt grief and relief in proportions I could not have predicted. The months that followed were not simple. They were not supposed to be. Rosa Gutierrez's complaint was the one that opened the full investigation. Patricia's contact at the state attorney's office had already begun preliminary work, and the public filing gave them the anchor they needed. By January, the investigation had expanded to include all 6 Caldwell locations. 3 former employees had come forward with documentation. The Delaware property arrangement was referred to a separate federal inquiry. Franklin and Diane retained separate attorneys in November, which told you something. 2 of the restaurant locations closed in February. The flagship downtown remained open under new management while the legal process continued. The staff, from what I read, had been offered back pay agreements as part of an early settlement structure. Sophia and Daniel moved into their new house in December, as planned. Sophia took a leave from the family business and began talking to a nonprofit that worked with restaurant industry workers on wage and rights education. She told me about it over Sunday dinner, the first Sunday dinner she and Daniel hosted in their new home, and I sat at their table and felt something settle in my chest. Daniel did not speak to me for 6 weeks after the wedding. I understood. I'd taken the most important day of his life and made it something else. And even if it needed to be made into something else, that cost him something real. I did not chase him. I sent a letter, handwritten, 3 pages, explaining everything in the order it had happened and the reasons for every decision. I told him I had been wrong to wait as long as I did. I told him I was not sure there had been a right time, only less wrong ones, and I tried to find the least wrong one. I told him that he was the best thing I'd ever done and that his happiness was not something I would ever knowingly sacrifice. He called me on a Tuesday evening in late November. "I read your letter 4 times," he said. "Okay," I said. "Sophia says you saved her from spending her life not knowing." "I hope so." A long silence, not an uncomfortable one. "She also says the woman from the dispatch is doing a 3-part series." I heard that. "Mom," his voice shifted. "Those workers. Rosa." "Yes." "If you hadn't—" He stopped. "I know," I said. He exhaled. "Okay, Sunday dinner. Sophia wants to try the pot roast recipe." I sat in my kitchen after we hung up, and I looked out at my garden, brown and quiet in November, waiting for the other side of winter. I thought about Rosa Gutierrez, who I had never met, who had filed a complaint and been silenced and then found the courage to try again. I thought about all the people who had worked in those kitchens and eaten the indignity of it quietly because they did not have options. I thought about Diane Caldwell sitting at the head table in her practiced stillness, calculating what she could not control. And I thought about what 32 years of following numbers had actually been about. Not the numbers themselves, the people behind them, the ones the numbers were supposed to represent and usually didn't. I'm 61 years old. I spent my career in a quiet office making sure things added up. I retired because I thought that chapter was finished. But the skills you build over a lifetime do not retire when you do. And the obligation to use them when it matters does not expire. If you are someone who has been made to feel like your origins are a limitation, like your background is something to overcome rather than something to stand on, I want you to hear this. The people working hardest to make you feel that way are almost always doing it because they have something they need you not to look at too closely. Look closely, find the records, ask the questions, follow the thread wherever it goes, no matter how unglamorous that work turns out to be. The truth does not always arrive the way you hope. It is usually quieter than you expect and more expensive, and it takes longer. But it is the only foundation anything real can be built on. I know that because I spent my life in the spaces between the numbers, and I know what it looks like when the foundation is solid and when it only looks that way from a certain angle in a certain light. The difference matters. It always has.